Moving a physical box across an ocean is a predictable logistical challenge, but the exact moment the legal liability for that box transfers from the seller to the buyer, that is where supply chains actually break down. This schematic illustrates the four structural pillars of Incoterms 2020. These three-letter codes are not shipping suggestions. They are standardized legal mechanisms that lock down exact transfer points for risk, cost, location, and customs burden. The International Chamber of Commerce updated these rules in 2020 to reflect modern containerized logistics. Yet many industry professionals continue to write international contracts using outdated definitions and legacy habits. The most costly resulting error is a misalignment between the party paying the freight invoice and the party actually holding the physical risk of the cargo in transit. To dismantle these structural errors, we are going to map the 2020 framework. We will isolate the financial traps hidden at the extreme ends of the liability spectrum and correct the pervasive misapplication of multimodal terms. Treating a three-letter Incoterm as a simple pricing mechanism rather than a definitive legal boundary line directly drives unmanaged financial liability in global trade. This timeline tracks a shipment from origin factory to destination warehouse. 3 bars measure the seller's legal responsibility, risk, cost, and customs. At the starting extreme, EXW, these bars shrink to near zero, ending at the seller's loading dock doors. Operationally, this forces the foreign buyer to navigate and execute the origin country's export customs procedures, a legal system they likely have no experience navigating. As detailed in this official excerpt, if the foreign buyer fails that export procedure, the seller loses the specific documentation required to justify that or tax exemptions on an international sale. Jumping to the opposite end of the spectrum, the diagram models DDP, or Delivered Duty Paid. The seller's risk, cost, and customs bars now stretch entirely across the ocean, right up to the destination facility. Under DDP, the seller accepts the maximum possible liability. They are now fully responsible for clearing foreign import customs and paying all destination taxes. Looking at the official guidelines for DDP, we see the immediate margin trap. Without a registered legal entity in the destination country, the seller cannot deduct these import taxes, needlessly inflating their own operating costs. The actionable fix for EXW is straightforward. Replace it with FCA at origin. This keeps the seller in control of crucial export documentation. To avoid the DDP margin trap, sellers should step back to DAP, or Delivered at Place, shifting final import clearance back to the domestic buyer. Adopting extreme liability terms shifts customs burdens onto parties lacking expertise to navigate foreign tax law, creating immediate financial loss. Moving inward on our timeline brings us to the F terms, like FCA, FAS, and FOB. Here, both the seller's cost and risk bars stop identically at the exact point of handover to the main carrier. Because the buyer controls the main transport, the seller hands over physical risk and financial cost simultaneously at the origin port. But when we transition to the C terms, CPT, CIP, CFR, and CIF, the dynamic fractures. The timeline shows the seller's cost bar extending across the ocean to the destination port, while the risk bar remains stubbornly anchored back at origin. This represents a critical structural divergence. The financial payment of the freight has been completely decoupled from the transfer of physical liability. The seller pays the invoice to destination. But if cargo is lost mid-transit in heavy seas, the buyer holds the physical risk. The strategic value of C terms lies in this separation. It allows the seller to control logistics costs without extending liability into unpredictable transit environments. This precise decoupling mechanism is why these terms are the strongly recommended standard for complex multimodal shipments. Confusing who pays the carrier with who legally owns the risk inside the container is a fatal liability blind spot. This brings us to the most pervasive industry error identified in the text, defaulting to FOB or CIF when shipping standard intermodal containers. As highlighted in Section 4.2.1 of the documentation, terms like FAS, FOB, CFR, and CIF are exclusively categorized for maritime transport. They were designed to dictate risk transfer strictly when cargo is placed alongside or onto a ship's deck. Modern intermodal logistics operate differently. Containers are typically dropped off at inland yards or port terminals days, sometimes weeks before a vessel actually arrives. A container waits under FOB terms. The risk transfer line sits at the ship's edge, leaving yard damage uninsured. For containers, use multimodal equivalents. Watch FOB become FCA. The risk line shifts backward to the exact moment the truck drops the container. Making this shift also prevents the seller from being ambushed by uncontrollable port handling charges they never negotiated with the buyer's carrier. Using a 19th century maritime rule for a 21st century intermodal container actively creates uninsured, ambiguous gaps in the supply chain. Pivoting to insurance mandates, the 2020 updates specifically targeted the CIP and CIF terms. Historically, both rules only required the seller to provide a minimum baseline of cargo insurance. Under the new split, if you are using CIF for maritime transport, that minimum required coverage remains the lower tier ICCC level. But for CIP in multimodal transport, the text explicitly notes the mandate has evolved. Sellers are now strictly required to provide maximum ICCA or all-risk coverage. Looking at destination delivery terms, the 2010 term DAT, or delivered at terminal, was removed. It was deemed too restrictive for modern logistics. In its place, the 2020 rules introduced DPU, delivered at place unloaded. As the text specifies, this is the only Incoterm that legally obligates the seller to perform the physical unloading in the destination country. This creates operational danger. A seller absolutely must verify physical infrastructure and personnel to unload at the destination before agreeing to DPU. These updates close historical loopholes. Deploying them without verifying foreign infrastructure will paralyze a shipment right at the finish line. Bringing the entire framework together, this master grid maps the zones of control. Green safe zones highlight FCA, CPT, CIP, and DAP. Red danger zones isolate EXW, DDP, and the misuse of FOB and CIF. The grid reveals a counterintuitive reality of global trade. Attempting to minimize your own logistical responsibility often maximizes your regulatory and tax risk. Conversely, attempting to offer maximum end-to-end service to a client can trigger crippling foreign tax burdens if the contract is not structured perfectly. The golden rule for modern supply chains remains clear. Match the legal term directly to the physical mode of transport, and keep maritime terms exclusively on the water. Incoterms are a voluntary framework. However, the moment those three letters are typed into a contract, they become absolute, enforceable legal boundaries. Defaulting to legacy terms purely out of habit, without understanding their 2020 redefinitions, guarantees systemic inefficiency. True supply chain optimization is achieved by engineering the precise moment financial risk changes hands.